Welcome to another in a series of videos by the Park Society. To learn more about the Park Society, visit the Society's website and the Parks DNA project at the links given at the end of this video. Today's topic is parks in the South, where they came from, how they got here, where they went. While many of us have done a good deal of research on our own particular parks family, I thought it would be interesting to step back and take a broader look at some of the various parks lines as they made their way to this country, where some of them settled in or migrated to the south. We'll take a brief look at some of the early migration routes they would have used, and then do a quick survey of some of the lines as they moved through the south and into other parts of the country. By the way, whenever you hear me repeat the surname Parks today, I'm referring to PARK/E/S, including all of those various spellings of the name. This is far from a complete or exhaustive treatment. Even if I were knowledgeable enough to do justice to all the different parks lineages, which I'm not, we'd be here for days trying to discuss and sort them all out, something the Park Society's been working on for nearly 60 years. Before we begin to talk about specifics, I'd like to hop over to the other side of the Atlantic for a moment. We're all pretty familiar with the idea of families migrating from one place to another here in America, but this was really only a continuation of a pattern that had been going on from the time modern man walked out of Africa. Certainly, when we consider our ancestors from the British Isles, we learned that this was always a population on the move. In Buckinghamshire, northwest of London, between 1573 and 1584, more than 80% of the population had moved at least once in their lives. This finding has been repeated in many English counties under the Tudors and Stuarts. These British people on the move might be landless younger sons of high-born families, pilgrims, yeomen in search of land, laborers looking for work, seamen looking for a ship, orphans or beggars. One study found that the poor made longer journeys than did the rich. Nearly 1/4 of English vagrants traveled more than 100 miles at a time. Some of this movement was what scholars call subsistence migration, an attempt to survive in an economy of scarcity. Another type was termed betterment migration, similar to most of the American migration where families went looking for less developed land to establish themselves. In Britain, some of this betterment migration led in another direction, to the sea. Port cities like London and Bristol were popular destinations where families headed in hopes of eventually boarding ships bound for the New World. English migration to America began at an earlier date and in a different way than our schoolbook histories taught us. From 1578 to 1625, more than 30 English-speaking colonies were begun in what is now the United States. We were generally only taught about 3, Roanoke, Jamestown, and Plymouth. The others began without fanfare and left only the faintest traces behind. Some were fishing stations founded as early as the 16th century. Others were small farming settlements begun in the early 17th century. Single individuals also found their way from Europe to America. The founders of Jamestown and Plymouth both discovered traces of Europeans who had been there earlier. The Pilgrims found on Cape Cod a place like a grave, and within it a skull with fine yellow hair still on it, bound up with a needle, a knife, a sailor's canvas cassock, and a pair of cloth breeches. Alongside were the bones of a child in a small bundle. The Jamestown colonists discovered in the interior of Virginia, about 20 miles from the present site of Richmond, a boy about the age of 10 years, which had a head of hair of a perfect yellow and a reasonable white skin, which is a miracle among the savages. In other parts of the Chesapeake region, Children were seen with light chestnut hair and fair complexions, who may have descended from the lost colonists of Roanoke or from shipwrecked seamen. All this evidence of early migration reminds us that the settlement of English-speaking America was merely an extension of incessant migration in the Old World. Now let's see what we can learn about which parks were likely to have come from which area of the British Isles. There's a wonderful book by David Hackett Fisher entitled Albion's Seed: Four British Folkways in America, which some of you may be familiar with. In this book, Mr. Fisher discusses the four major British groups that settled in this country, what part of Britain they were likely to have come from, why they left Britain, and in which part of America each group tended to settle. The first group is the English Puritans, who came mainly from East Anglia to Massachusetts in the Great Exodus from 1629 to 1641. One unique feature of migration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony was that these people considered themselves a twice chosen people, once by God and again by the General Court of Massachusetts. The other English colonies gladly welcomed any two-legged creature who could be dragged onto a ship bound for America, but Massachusetts chose its colonists with care. Not everyone was allowed to settle there, and in doubtful cases, the founders of the colony actually demanded written proof of good character. Further, after these immigrants arrived, those who did not fit in were either banished to other colonies or sent back to England. Another distinctive feature of the founders of Massachusetts is that they traveled in families, more so than any major ethnic group in American history. In one group of 700 immigrants to the colony, 94% belonged to family groups. In another group of 680, 88% traveled with relatives, and 73% arrived as members of a complete nuclear family. These proportions were the highest in the entire history of American immigration. Further, many of these nuclear families that arrived in Massachusetts were related to one another before they left England. Two Parks lineages that came to New England during this time period are identified by their male Parks immigrants. Robert Park, who came to Massachusetts with the Winthrop fleet in 1630 from Suffolk, a county of East Anglia, and Richard Park, who arrived in Boston on the ship Defense in 1635. The second group of British immigrants came from the south of England, mainly to Virginia, and were comprised of what Mr. Fisher calls distressed cavaliers and indentured servants. This immigrant group came during the time period of 1642 to 1675. You'll remember that Jamestown was founded in 1607, so this is a later wave of immigration. David Hackett Fisher has also co-authored a book with James C. Kelly entitled Bound Away: Virginia and the Westward Movement. In this book, he describes in great detail the early years of the Jamestown colony and the Virginia Company of London's troubles in attempting to establish a thriving colony in Virginia. The striking difference from the pattern of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is that Jamestown was settled as a business enterprise and was seen more as a base for further exploration than as a settlement of families. All of the original settlers of Jamestown were male. They were also very different from other English settlers in America. Most were called gentlemen and were recruited from a narrow elite that made up only 10% of the English population in 1607, yet they comprised 60% of the Jamestown followers. The placement of the colony was 20 miles up the James River, on a peninsula chosen for its anchorage. George Percy reported, "Our ships do lie so near the shore that they are moored to the trees in 6-fathom water." 6 fathoms is 36 feet. This anchorage was important because they were searching for, among other things, a passage to the South Sea. In 1579, Sir Francis Drake had sailed the coast of California and seen a range of mountains not far from the sea. When the Native Americans of Virginia indicated that there were mountains to be found only a few days' march inland, the founders of Jamestown leapt to the conclusion that the South Sea was no more than a 10 days' journey distance. This idea that the continent was only several hundred miles wide was a long time dying. This map we're looking at is a map of Virginia published in 1651. If we turn it to a north-south orientation, you can see that they thought the Pacific Ocean was just over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Were they in for a surprise? The story of the original Jamestown colony was one of ultimate failure. Disease and starvation kept the colony at a minimal existence until an attack by Native Americans in 1622 nearly destroyed the colony. The Virginia Company tried to revive it, but the situation worsened. The company lost its right to raise money by lottery and slipped into bankruptcy. The settlement passed into the hands of the Privy Council, and in 1624, Virginia became a royal colony. The period from 1624 to 1642 saw the colony begin to grow, and despite high mortality rates from malaria and other causes, the colony reached a point where its survival was not in question. Then major economic problems developed. The tobacco crop, which had been the colony's main source of income, began to glut the European market, and prices fell from a high of 3 shillings a pound in the 1620s to a few pence in the 1630s. Two systems of social development began to compete, with some areas of the colony increasingly dominated by small freehold farmers, others by large estates, usually held by absentee owners. It was not clear which of these two systems would dominate. In the area of religion, Puritans were beginning to settle in the colony, especially in Norfolk and Nansemond counties and on the eastern shore. An assembly was founded in 1619 and began to meet annually, not at the request of the inhabitants, but on orders from London. The governor, council, and representatives from 4 boroughs jointly exercised the power of taxation. The early royal governors struggled against these representative bodies, and several governors came and went in succession, unable to deal with the problems before them. Finally, in 1642, Sir William Berkeley was appointed governor, a position he was to hold off and on for more than 35 years, from 1642 until he was removed from office following Bacon's rebellion in 1676. Perhaps more than any other single individual, Sir William Berkeley shaped the political and social systems of Virginia. He played a major role in shaping the immigration process to the colony during this critical period. When the English Civil War proved unsuccessful for the Cavaliers, supporters of King Charles I and later Charles II, Berkeley actively encouraged these distressed Cavaliers to come to America, where he promoted them to high office, granted them large estates, and created the ruling class that ran the colony for many generations. It was these Cavalier families who would form the basis for the first families of Virginia. This wave of immigration to Virginia differed from the Puritan exodus to Massachusetts in several ways, in its English origins, in its American destination, and especially in its social composition. New England had drawn mostly from the middle of English society, where Virginians came in greater numbers from both the higher and lower ranks. Berkeley's distressed Cavaliers were only a small part of the total numbers who came to the Chesapeake colonies. The greater portion of immigrants were humble people of low rank. More than 75% came as indentured servants. Virginia's servants were recruited from the lower strata of English society, but not from the very lowest. the bottom of the middle ranks, one historian has written. Unlike most emigrants to New England, their passage was paid by others. Altogether, females were outnumbered by males by more than 4 to 1. Few women freely chose to settle in Virginia. Some were snared and sent against their will. Most of Virginia's servant immigrants were half-grown boys and young men. More than a few of these were spirited or kidnapped by gangs, or were lagged or transported by hard-hearted judges after being arrested for petty crimes or vagrancy and sold for a slave in Virginia. We tend to think of indentured servants as people making a business deal in return for free transportation to this country, but aside from the fact that their term of indenture was for a fixed time period rather than for life, their condition differed little from the slavery experienced by Africans. These immigrants to Virginia who arrived not as indentured servants, but in chains as transported convicts, met with differing opinions about their presence in the colony. The first convicts arrived a few years after the founding of Jamestown, but by 1670 the colony passed a law forbidding the immigration of prisoners. However, in 1717, Parliament passed a law for the more effectual transportation of felons, and after that date criminals began to arrive in large numbers. Recent studies have estimated the convict traffic to North America in the 18th century at about 50,000 from Britain and Ireland. Of all the British and Irish convicts sent to America, as many as half came to Maryland and Virginia. In some years, the proportion who came to the Chesapeake was as high as 90%. The convict trade was deeply resented in America. One quote from the Virginia Gazette in 1751 asked, "Can Britain show a more sovereign contempt for us than by emptying their jails into our settlements, unless they would likewise empty their jakes on our tables?" And jake was a slang term for a toilet. Some of these convicts escaped to the frontier. In 1748, the inhabitants of the Albemarle County asked help to suppress an entire settlement of horse thieves who had established themselves into a confederacy. By any comparative test, the frontier of the Delaware Quakers and the New England Puritans was much less disorderly than the southern frontier. Patterns of migration tend to help to explain the difference. The character of Virginia's Great Migration differed in many ways from the Puritan exodus to Massachusetts. From the start, immigrants to the Chesapeake were more highly stratified, more male, less highly skilled, and less literate. These patterns did not develop by chance, but were the product of policy and social planning. Reflecting the heavy concentration of immigration from the south and west of England, the Virginia accent developed from a cluster of rural dialects from that area of England. In architecture, the conventional hall and parlor Virginia house was a south of England building modified to suit American conditions. The idea of family in Virginia was not the nuclear model that took root in Puritan Massachusetts, but a more organic, extended, hierarchical, and patriarchal form that had existed throughout the south of England. The naming of children also differed from New England. Less than half of Virginians received biblical names. Males were named after warriors and kings: William, Robert, George, Edward. Rituals of worship in Virginia from 1650 to the mid-18th century ran to a liturgical style rather than the meeting and lecture style of New England. The Anglican establishment was much stronger before 1740 than many historians had believed, and dissent was largely suppressed. More adult Virginians attended Anglican services and took communion than in England. Sir William Berkeley and his Cavalier elite did not only recruit immigrants to support their model colony, they also tried to drive out people who did not fit in. Chief among these were Puritans and Quakers. William Stone was a nonconformist Anglican who led a group from Virginia's eastern shore to Maryland. He later became governor of Maryland and encouraged a group of Puritans to emigrate from Virginia farther up the bay, where they founded the town of Providence in what is now Anne Arundel County, Maryland. After 1660, the Virginia legislature forbade nonconformist preaching, required baptism in an Anglican church, and prohibited Quaker meetings. The Quakers began to move in large numbers, some moving north to Maryland's eastern shore and settling in Somerset County. At the same time, Virginia's Cavalier elite also drove out others in a different way. The leaders of the colony arrogated to themselves much of the best land. Young servants found better opportunities in Maryland and the southern counties of Delaware. A large portion of the eastern shore was settled in this way. As a result, Maryland became a more diverse society, while Virginia became more closed and homogeneous. Other servants and debtors fled south beyond the borders of Virginia. Governor Thomas Culpeper, who followed Berkeley, wrote in 1661, "Carolina, I mean the north part of it, always was and is the sink of America, the refuge of renegados." I have perhaps dwelt on Virginia a bit too long here, but since many of the southern parks either emigrated directly to Virginia or passed through it on their way further south, I felt it was important to spend time exploring its history and why its people were so different from other groups in early American history. Though there are many parks with Virginia connections, perhaps the most researched and far-reaching is the Thomas Lineage Key Seed Line. Next, we'll talk a bit about the Friends migration from 1675 to 1775. The Society of Friends, popularly known as Quakers, came largely from the North Midlands of England to the Delaware Valley. Individual Quakers had been in the American colonies as early as the 1650s, only a few years after the founding of the Society of Friends in England. Most of these earliest Quakers in America were wandering evangelists and missionaries and, just as we mentioned, were punished cruelly by the Puritans and Anglicans, just as they had been in England. The larger movement of Quakers to America began in 1675, when the first full shipload of Quakers came to West Jersey, a place which they named Salem, from the Hebrew shalom, the word for peace. Other ships soon followed, carrying some 1,400 Quakers to West Jersey by 1681. Indeed, our best-known example of a Parks line from this group is Roger Park, Lineage Key K, who arrived in West Jersey about 1682. He did indeed come from the North Midland area. Many of his descendants migrated south over the generations. Many people do not realize that West Jersey was largely a Quaker settlement, several years before William Penn received his charter to found Pennsylvania in 1681. Indeed, William Penn was a trustee in West Jersey and drew up the fundamental laws of that colony prior to founding Pennsylvania. In the interest of time, we will not go into a lengthy discussion of the Quakers in Pennsylvania, except to say that one aspect of their belief, pacifism, led in part to the presence in Pennsylvania of the next group we will discuss. The last of the four groups to come to America from Britain is termed by Mr. Fisher as Borderlands to the Backcountry, the flight from North Britain, 1717 to 1775. While this group is commonly known by various names such as Scots-Irish, Scotch-Irish, Ulster Scots, Mr. Fisher and others point out that all of these terms are somewhat misleading, inaccurate, and incomplete in describing the origins of this group of immigrants. These immigrants came from an area which included the English counties of Westmoreland, Cumberland, Northumberland, Durham, and the North Riding of Yorkshire, together with the southern counties of Scotland. As early as the 15th century, this region was called the Border or Borders, and its inhabitants called themselves Borderers. These people of Scotland and northern England, together with their transplanted cousins in the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland, were very mixed in their ethnicity, but shared a common culture which was shaped by the history of their region. More than 60% of the settlers in the American backcountry were immigrants or the children of immigrants from Northern Ireland, the lowlands of Scotland, and the 6 northern counties of England. I won't go into the history of these people, but there is an excellent book called Born Fighting: How the Scots-Irish Shaped America by James Webb. He has served as a United States Senator from Virginia, Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and is a decorated Marine Corps officer. He also wrote the screenplay for the 2000 film Rules of Engagement. He writes very well, and I would highly recommend this book to anyone seeking to learn more about this subject. Basically, the history of these borderers over many generations shaped their culture in a way that well suited them to deal with the difficulties to be found on the American frontier. James Logan was born near Belfast in 1674 of Scottish parents. His father was an Anglican clergyman who became a Quaker and thereafter worked as a schoolmaster. Logan was apprenticed at 13 to a linen merchant in Dublin and later fled Ireland with his family to Bristol, England, to escape the uprisings that led to the siege of Londonderry. Due to his Quaker faith and his involvement in the linen industry, Logan was befriended and then personally recruited by William Penn, who in 1699 appointed him provincial secretary of the Pennsylvania colony. Logan's principal role was to act as William Penn's land agent and administrator, and in that capacity he was the agent for all land sales in Pennsylvania. He was also responsible for the burgeoning fur trade and for relations with the Native American tribes. As the years progressed, tensions with the Native Americans increased, and it became clear to Logan that forming a government with the strictly pacifist principles of the Quakers was impractical. The Native Americans were threatening many settlements, yet the Quakers who controlled the colony's affairs could not bring themselves to raise a militia to counter the incidents of violence at the mountainous edges of the colony. So Logan, who remembered well the fighting spirit of the Ulster Scots at Londonderry and elsewhere, convinced the Pennsylvania government to encourage their immigration to settlements he would create along the mountains west of Philadelphia. Logan set aside a large tract of land for the Ulster Scots near modern-day Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which the settlers named Donegal in memory of the northern Irish county near Londonderry from which they had migrated. But after settling the land Logan had earmarked for them, they then proceeded to expand in every direction without regard to who owned the properties. They began building small farms on virgin land owned by absentee landlords, largely inventing the concept of squatters' rights. 10 years after first recruiting them, Logan lamented that a settlement of 5 families from the north of Ireland gives me more trouble than 50 of any other people, and that they were troublesome settlers to the government and hard neighbors to the Indians. In contrast to the Swiss-German immigrants during this period who, once they found a home, tended to remain fixed, the Scots-Irish had a tendency to move 3 or 4 times before finally settling into a permanent home. One result of this mobility is that excellent land in Pennsylvania that had originally belonged to Ulstermen now came into the hands of the Swiss Germans, now known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Scots-Irish were indeed restless. They showed no hesitation in pushing into Indian territory and settling on lands claimed by the tribal chiefs. In doing so, they actually helped light the torch of Indian resentment rather than discourage uprisings through a forceful defensive presence, as Logan had hoped. They pressed ever westward across the Pennsylvania mountains and were among the first settlers of Pittsburgh. Some were lured by Pennsylvania's proprietors into settling along the Maryland border, where they might be happy in constituting the frontier line against encroaching Maryland Catholics. But their greatest push was to the southwest, along the Great Valley Road that took them into settlements that spanned the spine of Virginia and eventually led to the western reaches of North and South Carolina. Now that we've touched on the four groups of Park's immigrants from the British Isles, I'd like to take just a few minutes to look at some of the migration routes our Park's ancestors, along with so many others, might have used in making their way south from various locations. Many of these early roads began as animal paths, which the Native Americans then used and made even more passable by foot at least. Over time, explorers then settled and improved these routes, many of which, as we will see in a moment, were still in use today. In fact, some surveyors have stated that man could not have picked a better route than the one chosen by animals. Travel for many years was primarily by ship along the coast, with early roads extending inland for only a few miles. After the English took over New Amsterdam, King Charles II expressed a desire for a road to connect his colonies, and the Boston Post Road was established, connecting Boston and New York. By 1750, this road ran from Boston all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, and was known as the King's Highway. The Susquehanna River is a natural route to the interior of Pennsylvania, but the earliest western migrations out of Philadelphia had no access to the Susquehanna without first traveling to the mouth of the river in Maryland, a rather roundabout journey. As early as 1725, a road known as the Lancaster Road was begun from Philadelphia to the present-day city of Lancaster, then on to Harrisburg, which lies on the Susquehanna River. Much of this road became a part of the Lincoln Highway, the first road across the country, and is present-day US 30. From Harrisburg, the Philadelphia Wagon Road headed south through Maryland, leading to the Great Valley Road through the Shenandoah Valley. As you navigate up the rivers along the eastern coast, at some point you'll come to a waterfall, where the land begins to rise into the Piedmont section, heading eventually to the mountains. When this point was reached, any goods on a boat heading either direction would have to be offloaded to get around the falls. Often a settlement would be established at that point, many developing into towns and cities. If we connect this series of waterfalls up and down the coast, we get what was known as the fall line, and indeed, a road developed by about 1735 connecting these points up and down the coast. If you want to know how a Park's ancestor traveled from Pennsylvania or Maryland to the interior of the Carolinas before 1750, the King's Highway and the Fall Line Road were probably the routes they took. A road was completed in 1746 known as the Pioneers Road, which ran from Alexandria, Virginia to Winchester, the westernmost town in Virginia at that time. This road made its way through the Blue Ridge Mountains west of Alexandria at Ashley Gap, making Winchester the northern access point to the Great Valley Road. Because of this road, Alexandria became a more popular port than Philadelphia for many Scots-Irish immigrants who came from 1746 up until the Revolutionary War. Also in the mid-1740s, the proprietary governor of the Granville District, approximately the northern third of North Carolina counties today, began issuing land grants to Quakers and others from the Tidewater counties of Virginia and North Carolina. They were soon joined by Scots-Irish immigrants who came in great numbers. The upper road, which began as a trail, was improved to become a major access route to these lands by 1748. It began at Fredericksburg on the Kings Highway and continued across Virginia to North Carolina, running west of the Fall Line Road. Lastly, the Great Valley Road, which began as the Great Warrior Path, was also known as the Great Wagon Road and runs through the Shenandoah Valley. In 1744, a treaty with the Native Americans gave whites total control of the area east of the Great Warrior Path in Virginia. During the period 1745 to 1775, thousands of immigrants used this road. Many were Scots-Irish who had sailed from Ireland to Philadelphia or Alexandria. By the early 1750s, traveling down to the southwestern end at Big Lick, now Roanoke, settlers could continue south into North Carolina or head southwest into eastern Tennessee. In 1750, Thomas Walker passed through and named the Cumberland Gap. For many years, it was little more than a trail, until Daniel Boone was hired by the Transylvania Company in 1774 to mark out a road through the gap. At first, the Wilderness Road was not really a road, and settlers learned that they would have to abandon their wagons at Sapling Grove, now Bristol, and pack their belongings on horses to get to Kentucky. Only pack horses could cross through the gap until 1796, when the trail was widened enough to allow a Conestoga wagon to pass. After 1796, a Scots-Irish immigrant could start out from the end of their sea journey at Alexandria and make it all the way to the middle of Kentucky in the same wagon. As I mentioned earlier, many of our modern roads and interstates follow the route of these early roads fairly closely. In my own case, I take I-81 all the way down from Scranton, Pennsylvania, following the route of the Great Wagon Road through Virginia, pretty much all the way to visit my relatives in East Tennessee. I'm sure many of you have driven the same route or along the path of other early roads. If you've ever headed south to Florida from the Northeast, you probably took I-95, which follows in part the route of the Kings Highway and the Fall Line Road. But we're not going to look at any particular parks family in depth here, but let's take a look at this map and chart from an earlier Park Society newsletter, which shows just how many parks immigrants have been found in early Virginia alone. Some of you watching this are participants in the Parks DNA project, and others of you are likely familiar with the project as well. One of the goals of the project, ambitious though it may be, is to find one or more representatives of each of these parks' immigrant lines and learn which of these various immigrants may have been related to one another. In this next map, also from a past newsletter, we see some of the various parks as they begin to show up in various counties in Virginia and what is now West Virginia. As some of these lines began to migrate further south or west, we find cases where there might be two or more parks lineages settling in the same counties in other colonies or states. DNA can be a valuable tool in helping sort out the various lineages in these instances. I included this map of the Delmarva Peninsula to show Tangier Island, a tiny island in the Chesapeake Bay. One of the early families on this island was a Parks family, supposedly related to the Parks from Accomack County on the eastern shore of Virginia. I believe this Parks line is supposedly from Lancashire County in England, and I would love to have this line represented in the DNA database someday. Here is a map showing some of the counties in Virginia and North Carolina where descendants of the Thomas Lineage Key C line settled. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the most widely researched Virginia-based lines and is also very well represented in our DNA surname project. From Virginia and North Carolina, this family has spread across the country, including many states in the South. Almost all the parks to be found in Lincoln, Franklin, and Moore counties in Tennessee are descended from this line. This area of Virginia, the old Frederick County, later split off into several counties in Virginia and what is now West Virginia. Some of the descendants from at least two Parks families found here later settled in what became Rowan County, North Carolina, causing researchers many headaches trying to separate them. One of these lineages is the Roger Park of New Jersey lineage key K line. When David Cox forced the inhabitants of that part of New Jersey to repurchase their own property, some Roger Park descendants left and settled in Frederick County, some later moving to North Carolina in an area known as the Jersey Settlement. Again, this is another case where DNA testing can help sort out matters. As I mentioned earlier, time will not permit us to discuss the many Parks lineages with southern roots in detail, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how many we have in our given name index. This is not all of them, as time has not permitted me to get all the way through the database, but as you can see, even as far as along as I got, there are quite a few. I've underlined and put in bold those lineage keys for which we have DNA representation. And you can see that there are many more for which we do not have a DNA signature. Just taking this small representation, I can point out that of those we have DNA for, several of them are indeed genetically connected to others. For instance, my own lineage key, AP, is connected to lineage key IP, which is Park Society trustee Wilma Hanley's Parks line. So we know we're distant cousins. We just don't know exactly how or when or where our lines share a common male Parks ancestor. The lineage key IP founder, Hugh Parks Sr., left the South, moving with his family to Kentucky, then on to Indiana, and Wilma and many of her family grew up in Kansas. In case you're interested, here are the 3 books I referenced earlier in the presentation. To learn more about the Parks Society and the Parks DNA Project, including information on how to join both, please visit our websites. So, we've seen that though many of us share the same surname, our Parks ancestors did not arrive here willy-nilly, but came from distinct areas and settled in different regions with cultural, religious, and social distinctions. As time progressed, they continued their migration here in America. And the reason for that continuing migration within this country was largely about one thing: land. Coming from a place where land was in short supply and only available to a few, America offered the opportunity to own property that was just not possible for most back in Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. Writing in the Geographical History of America in 1936, Gertrude Stein, of all people, wrote, "In the United States, there is more space where nobody is than where anybody is. That is what makes America what it is." As we travel around this country, it's striking how much undeveloped land there is even today. The vastness of the wilderness back then must have been a powerful magnet, drawing people with enough force to overcome their fear of the very real dangers and hardships they would surely face. As we trace our ancestors, we're not only watching our family move through time, but with a knowledge of their migrations, we watch them move through space as well. As genealogists, we sometimes think of ourselves as historians or detectives or judge and jury sifting and weighing evidence. I like to think we are also explorers as well. As fellow explorers here, I leave you with this thought from the poet T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Thank you for joining us here, and please stay tuned for future installments here on the Park Society YouTube channel.